Hey there, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Deleuze and Guattari's essay, May 68 Did Not Take Place. Now, the title alone is enough to incite some confusion, so I think it's important to take this one step at a time and take particular care to look at the historical situation. So first, I think it's necessary to provide a little bit of background about what May 68 is, because plenty of people, especially those who are not French like myself, see May 68 and you think it's some random name drop of some date and it's just some esoteric event, but it's actually really, really important, not only in French politics, but in world politics, and it had a very particular historical existence, which Deleuze and Guattari are here problematizing a little bit, because they're basically trying to eliminate this notion that May 68 was a coherent, formal historical event. Now, in May of 68, in the entirety of this time in the 60s, 70s, 80s in France, we're situated within the Cold War, and we're situated within also a lot of civil rights issues that were going on in the US especially, but not only in the US. The French colonial empire was collapsing. Things like Algeria were becoming independent, which was a French colony for a long time, and it was very bloody and very politically arousing event. And all of this kind of creates a historical milieu in which left politics is starting to become significantly more prominent as a response to fascism in Italy and in Germany, and we could point to this in like Serbia and plenty of other places in which fascism was, think about the Spanish Civil War. Fascism was very prevalent in Europe, and of course with things like the Holocaust and kind of the final solution generally, it was shown to have some problems, and as such, left-wing politics was starting to become more popular. Now, left-wing politics had kind of been ruminating throughout the 19th century, and with the development of liberalism and things like this, there was an emphasis on freedom that was being established, and it was being taken in a number of different ways. We had republicanism, which was focused on creating republics, and we also had different variants of proper state formations as kind of imperialism is starting to go to the wayside. And we had, for example, the Russian Revolution in 1917, which they talk about in the beginning of this essay, if only with a brief name drop, in which the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia and established the Communist Party in Russia as the ruling political party. And thereafter, we kind of had a prominent form of left politics in state socialism or communism, or there are definitely different terms that will probably roughly encompass the same things, although I know the anarcho, socialisto, Marxo, Mao, all the different people that succumb to or subscribe to those beliefs, rather, will get on me about that. But regardless, in May 68, there was a political climate in which the universities were a brewing ground for lots of different political ideologies, and even just forms of political formation like anti-fascism, anarchism, of course communism and socialism. And it wasn't just left-wing politics, but left-wing politics dominated. And in May 68, as a response to the Vietnam War, which was committed on the behalf of the U.S. against Vietnam, and which was a particularly deadly war, also considering the fact that it was one of the first wars to be filmed and broadcast live on television. There was this interesting milieu in which French culture was dissatisfied with a lot of the previous notions of state formations and its relation to the well-being of people. And throughout May 68, there were a number of kind of outbursts and revolutions and taking to the streets. I'm pretty sure as much as a quarter of the entire French population was involved in strikes and protests and whatnot for May 68. So a very, very big movement, which is strange that many of us over here in the US and just outside of France maybe haven't heard of it. So considering that, Deleuze and Guattari want to combat the notion that this is a formal historical entity like we tend to view several other movements. And they open up by talking about the fact that in the 1789 revolution or the 1917 revolution in Russia, there's always a part of these events that is not reducible to what they call a social determinism or to causal chains. And that this is a kind of a weird ground to be in historically because, it's hard to distill it down into this digestible historical form, which is kind of similar to the combating of fascism in Europe, which itself is not a very unitary phenomenon. Fascism plays itself out in a number of different ways, which makes it really hard to do serious scholarship on fascism. But Deleuze and Guattari mentioned that historians will restore causality after the fact. They will kind of make a post hoc rationalization for, okay, this is the coherence of the movement. It wasn't understood at the time, but now we, in hindsight, do so. Contrary to this, Deleuze and Guattari say that the event is itself a splitting off from, a breaking with causality. It is a bifurcation, a lawless deviation, an unstoppable condition that opens up a new field of the possible. So generally here, they're going against a sort of historical determinism that assumes that history and events in general proceed by these very definite causal relations. And they're pointing to the fact that May 68 is particularly acausal and ahistorical in this regard. They say an event can be turned around, repressed, co-opted, betrayed, but still something survives that cannot be outdated. Only traders could say it's outdated. Even ancient, an event can never be outdated. It's an opening onto the possible. It enters as much into the interior of individuals as into the depths of a society. So they're trying to push for a form of looking at these historical entities as, of course, an assemblage-wide phenomenon. This is not something that is foreign to Deleuze and Guattari's politics and philosophy. But the point here is that you can't overcode these real-world events and fit them completely into their place as a historical phenomenon. Something is always going to slip. They talk about in A Thousand Plateaus that something is always going to come out of the box, or something is always going to slip out of the box, so to speak. Now, they go on to mention that these weren't completely acausal, that it is a mix within the context of May 68 between definite historical determinisms or causalities and those which were ahistorical and acausal and cannot be reduced to one moment proceeding from another in a very neat and organized fashion. They call May 68 a pure event, free from all normal or normative causalities. Its history is a series of amplified instabilities and fluctuations. And this is something Deleuze and Guattari like to do a lot, that many people will write off as needlessly problematizing by trying to kind of seep back into this, oh, it's just all this mysteriousness going on. It's like, no. They're just trying to point out the fact that we can't reduce these key moments in history to a history with a capital H, to a definite causal relation. Rather, they're this fluxy kind of milieu of instabilities and fluctuations and flows and metastable states that drift from one point to the other, but of which it is difficult to encapsulate this month of May 68. It's rather arbitrary itself that it happens to be May 68, because of course all this spilled over into the months before and after. May was just kind of the culminating period of this historical intensity. And that's probably the best way to think about their argument here, is that May 68 is more of a, like they call it, it's a pure event, it's a pure intensity which establishes new relations with various social classes and ways of being. And in trying to reduce it to a formalized historical phenomenon, we actually run the risk of failing to understand what was so special about this event. They mentioned that there are all these sorts of slogans and agitations and illusions in May 68, all these kind of formal, okay, let's rally around this, or let's use this slogan. But they say that this isn't what counts. What counts amounted to a visionary phenomenon, as if a society suddenly perceived what was intolerable in itself and also saw the possibility of change. It is a collective phenomenon in the form of, give me the possible or else I will suffocate. The possible does not pre-exist. It is created by the event. It is a matter of life. The event creates a new existence. It produces a new subjectivity, new relations with the body, with time, sexuality, the immediate surroundings, with culture, work. And the point here that they're trying to lay out is that really, May 68 is something of a visionary phenomenon, not insofar as it is seeing into the future, but insofar as it is using a cutting sort of vision to effectuate a real possibility for change. It is this incorporeal transformation, as they call it in the postulates of linguistics plateau in A Thousand Plateaus, in which something suddenly shifts. And it's like when a king states, I declare war. In that moment, a sudden incorporeal transformation occurs, in which suddenly we are on the offensive. Suddenly the entirety of a population engages in a binary relation with another population, and we are now in war. And war itself, of course, this is not a formal system. War, think of the Cold War in which May 68 is taking place. It was a Cold War. It was infamous for lacking this substantive combativeness, but rather it was this kind of metastable state of being in shock and culminating in like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there is this instability about what is going to happen, what's going to happen next. And they even have a whole plateau dedicated to this idea in A Thousand Plateaus, 3 novellas, or What Happened, where they talk about several novels which, when we try to ask what happened, we realize that we run into a brick wall, in which we cannot necessarily formalize or reduce what happened, but rather it's the kind of thing which you had to be there in order to experience. And I think that's part of the thing that they're trying to get at, is that May 68 is something that was equiprimordial with the actions that it created. That it was a creative entity itself, but not rather something which various creations created. May 68 in and of itself is nothing. When you talk about May 68, even if you just look at the Wikipedia article, it's just this amorphous mass of different protests and strikes and revolts and armed confrontations. And as such, it's rather a milieu of action. It is a proper name for something rather minoritarian, as they call it. It's just all these little events that are happening together. And thus, it is an effort to wrest from the state the ability to create the possible. As they say, give me the possible or else I'll suffocate. And the event of which May 68 is a key event in history is not itself purely historical. There is always a part of it which is ahistorical and which is a matter of life, which is to say, a matter of creating a situation, a context of action. And thus, the event, such as May 68, is producing new forms of subjectivity, new ways of interacting, and new ways of relating to certain past events that occurred in one's life. I think it's important to mention a small part in Thousand Plateaus on page 296, where they talk about the ahistorical, or the transhistorical, that which cannot be reduced to history. And they state, there is no act of creation that is not transhistorical and does not come up from behind or proceed by way of a liberated line. Creations are like mutant abstract lines that have detached themselves from the task of representing a world, precisely because they assemble a new type of reality that history can only recontain or relocate in punctual systems. And thus, what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to say with the ahistorical is that all these important moments which define new ways of being and really give one the inertia necessary to establish new ways of being that can't be totalized or reduced or controlled by predatory markets, for example, with the TikTok algorithm. That there's a small part of these events which can't be reduced, but rather operates by way of a liberated line, a line of flight, as they call it. And thus, the line of flight can be seen in May 68, not insofar as May 68 made these lines of flight, but it itself was a line of flight, a new way of interacting in which, it completely changed the social atmosphere of France. Because, of course, France has this long history of revolution and bolstering the mantle of freedom and fraternité, and nevertheless, May 68 was particularly peculiar in the way it gathered people together. Like I mentioned, I'm pretty sure it was something like 25% of the entire population of France was involved in this movement. Those kind of weaponized moments of subjectivity come very rarely, and thus we can appreciate Deleuze and Guattari's maybe slightly idealistic interpretation of May 68, because plenty of other thinkers, such as Jean Baudrillard, would take a very nihilistic approach to this historical time frame, and would say that, well, it really didn't succumb to much. And I'll probably do more lectures on those thinkers just to see some of the variation. But we can see here that Deleuze and Guattari are trying to point out that creativity did not die, and May 68 was a moment in which we realized that. An important element of Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy is that, as they call May 68 here a social mutation, they're trying to focus on movement that is not necessarily linear. It is translinear or multilinear. There are these points which you just can't reduce to anything else. They just stand alone. And this is not to say that they're not related to other historical times or events, but rather that, as they say, we can't necessarily draw the consequences or effects of these various events two lines of economic or political causality. As they say, society must be capable of forming collective agencies of enunciation that match the new subjectivity, in such a way that it desires its own mutation. It's a veritable redeployment. And it's important to note that there is a slight evolutionary ring to mutation. And the discussions they do around evolution in A Thousand Plateaus is pretty interesting. The ones that they do, especially in the geology of morals, and they do it later when they're talking about evolution versus involution, that there's always a part of evolution, as in evolution by natural selection, which operates as a veritable becoming. There's this moment where a mutation occurs that cannot be reduced to some sort of previous agency, but rather happens by random, and serves as a site of possibility for a number of different becomings. This allows for new traits to come about, new ways of processing hormones or creating proteins, all of which can have very interesting effects, and which occur readily at the molecular level. Us humans ourselves, we have on average maybe 200 mutations per person. And all of these can create all sorts of, for example, lactose tolerance or intolerance is controlled by a mutation. It just happened to be a very successful one, so many people have it, even though the majority of the world, of course, does not have lactose tolerance, or lactose persistence, rather. But here, what they're talking about with agencies of enunciation is these collective assemblages in which everyone speaks on the same frequency, so to speak. Which is not to say that this is some crowd mentality where the individual is lost, but rather in which different individualities that are searching for the same voice, the same political representation, can kind of unite with the same valence in such a way that a mutation occurs. Which is to say, in terms of historical language, these mutations are these events that cannot be reduced to a social determinism or a causal chain. They merely redeploy a subjectivity of a certain person or a certain group and make it such that new ways of existing can occur. They talk about this with regard to the New Deal in America or the Japanese boom, which allows for different sorts of reactionary structures to come about, but they also produced, as they say, initiative and creativity to conceive new social states capable of responding to the demands of the event. But on the contrary, they mentioned that following May 68, there was always this sentiment that things will settle down. That, that happened and now it's done with. This was this weird kind of social orgasm and then it just went away. No. That's the sort of reactionary mentality that wants to take something that makes the order of things uncomfortable and reduce it to an afterthought. Deleuze and Guattari are much more concerned with what might happen if we don't reduce this event to an afterthought like that, or a failed coup or something like that. Because part of this historical reductionism comes when we try to attach motives to May 68. They wanted to commit a coup against the French government, or they wanted to dismantle capitalism. It's like, no. Part of the problem with that is that May 68, because, as I said, 25% of the French population, this is such an all-encompassing social moment that you've got communists, you've got socialists, you've got anarcho-libertarians, you've got even some like Republicans who were just saying, look, we've had enough. We're going to do whatever we have to do to make something change. And thus, the motives are all over the place. The point is not to establish some collective motive where, okay, we're all fighting to establish a communist government. It's like, no, that's not the point. As they say, we're trying to effectuate a veritable redeployment, something that desires its own mutation, which is to say, a form of political organization that is going to be focused on a spontaneous register shift, which will allow collective modes of action to come about, which will allow the individual to insert themselves in several different assemblages and have several different voices, which can be associated with genuine forms of action. And in response to this kind of things will settle down mentality, they say that, things did settle down. But the problem is that May 68, as they say, was neither the result of nor a reaction to a crisis. It is rather the opposite. It is the current crisis in France, the impasse that stems directly from the inability of French society to assimilate May 68. And this is an important historical point to mention, is that part of the peculiarity with May 68 is really it was just the culmination of several different speeds and intensities of other political formalizations. We had the speed of reterritorialization, so to speak, of fascism, the speed at which fascism was spreading. We had and we still have today, the speed of the encapsulation of the world in a sort of Western hegemony, with the US in the war in Vietnam, and this was written in 1984, by the way, but we had shortly thereafter the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and all of these different things which were trying to establish a sort of one world order dominated by the US and France and Britain primarily, but also there were a number of other colonial powers coming out of fashion at the time. But the point is that there wasn't really one thing that just kind of sparked May 68. Because, like we said, stuff happened before May and after May. It wasn't just confined to May. We just kind of arbitrarily placed these lines here. There wasn't really one breaking point that happened. Certainly there were key moments, such as the war in Vietnam, but it can't be reduced to these things because, of course, there were political climates stirring. We could go all the way back to Marx and even before that to point out all these intensities that had been building, and this is just one of those redeployments of subjectivity, where there was no crisis that happened before, but rather the class consciousness and social consciousness of the historical situation reached a point where things just started to happen. Shit hit the fan, as some people would say. And what the crisis is, for Deleuze and Guattari, is the aftermath. It's the fact that French society still hasn't really been able to deal with 68. And, of course, I can only speak to this so partially because I myself am not French and have very little understanding of French culture and the current social climate in France. So I guess partially we'll just have to take Deleuze and Guattari's word and maybe do some other research. Deleuze and Guattari mentioned that all of the different reactions that have tried to redeploy a subjectivity after 68 have not really worked. They mention, for example, how could it now trigger an economic redeployment that would ever satisfy the expectations of the left? And the left is in quotation marks, and I think that is very intentional here because it is clear that the left is not a homogeneous entity. As much as right-wing media would like you to think that the left is a homogeneous entity, talk to someone who calls themselves a leftist and They could be anything from a communist to an anarcho-libertarian to a democratic socialist to a social democrat, which everyone hates the soc dems for some reason. But they mentioned that French society never came up with anything for the people. Nothing at school, nothing at work. Everything that was new was marginalized or reduced into caricature. And the point here, and they go on to mention this a little, is that you've got steel workers and dairy farmers, and they're all clutching their little modes of making themselves heard. But every collective enunciation by a new existence, as they say, by a new collective subjectivity was crushed in advance by the reaction against 68, on the left almost as much as on the right. Each time it appeared, the possible was closed off. And this is an important problem to mention, is there is always a possibility for change. Nothing can ever stop moving or stop becoming. There are merely these states of equilibrium that occur in politics, in biology, in physics, whatever it may be. And the important thing to figure out is, okay, how can we liberate these flows? And this is not a sort of arbitrary liberation, but it is a very serious attitude of liberation in response to things like fascism, which made people feel very liberated, but at the cost of a pure destruction. They talk in A Thousand Plateaus about the fact that at a certain point towards the end of, for example, the Third Reich, it didn't even matter whether or not they were winning the war. It was just kind of this almost, again, orgasmic intensity in which the German Empire was basically just killing itself. And it had to keep up this image of being this Kaiser kind of veritable force. And thus the forces that created the ordered ways of reducing people's being to, races in order to commit genocide against them and all this different stuff that occurs, especially in, for example, fascism, it almost kind of shows itself to be a caricature. It just reaches this point where it's huffing and puffing, and Deleuze and Guattari are trying to mention that all of these ways of becoming and organizing always have this potential to go like this, to just turn into, as they say, the abstract line of death in A Thousand Plateaus. It's just this point where we don't really know what to do, we can't do anything, and this is the double bind that is created by the social apparatus and by the state apparatus that caused May 68 to come about. It's one of the causes, we could say. They go on to talk about the children of May 68, and they say that you can run into them all over the place, even if they are not aware of who they are. Each country produces them in its own way. Their situation isn't so great. These are not young executives. These are strangely indifferent, and for this very reason are in the right frame of mind. They have stopped being demanding and narcissistic, but they know perfectly well that nothing today corresponds to their subjectivity, to their potential of energy. They even know that all current forms are rather directed against them. And this is a pessimism that is shared, for example, by Jean Baudrillard, who is lamenting this fact that people are just alienated. People don't really know how to gain a political voice, and with the increase of Western hegemony, it seems incredibly difficult for the quote-unquote third world, because that is just a problematic term in and of itself, to have a agency of enunciation or create a collective assemblage of enunciation, precisely because it is almost a siphoning off point for, things like child labor, for American businesses. And all of this culminates in, as they say, a sort of indifference. There's no more narcissism left of, the kind of Bolshevik, let's bring ourselves up by our bootstraps and establish the perfect communist society, that has gone quite a bit towards the wayside. And I think that's fairly obvious to see in any political climate, especially in the West. But there's basically this concession that all of our potential energy is kind of not really being used, and we don't really know how to use it. Now, it is important to mention that Deleuze and Guattari are not saying that there is no potential left. There is always potential in Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy. We could analogize this to physics to point out that there is always a potential energy which symbolizes a veritable becoming that can occur. A ball which is waiting to be dropped from the top of a ramp has a large potential energy. At its most territorialized point, it has the most potential for deterritorialization or for change. And thus, Deleuze and Guattari don't want to dispel with the sort of momentum that came from May 68, the children of May 68 that result. But they do point out the fact that this is true of the entire world, as they say. They say, what we institutionalize for the unemployed, the retired, or in school are controlled situations of abandonment. For these, the handicapped is the model. The only subjective redeployments actually occupying collectively are those of an unbridled American-style capitalism, of a Muslim fundamentalism like in Iran, or of Afro-American religion like in Brazil. The reversed figures of a new orthodoxy. One should add European neo-papism to the list. Lots of very strange terms here, but we're going to break this down. And they're trying to look at kind of the postmodern condition and say, we are in a sort of perplexing situation of abandonment. In relation to the state, there is this attitude of, oh, we want to give you your rights and we want you to be your own entrepreneur and decide your own hours and be the best person that you can be. But only if you can make a profit, and otherwise you're going to be homeless and we're going to install architecture and things on benches such that you can't sleep on them and then you'll just have to die. It's like all of this is this unbridled American-style capitalism that they talk about. This is one of the collective assemblages of enunciation that we see today. But it's a sort of handicapped model. It operates on a sort of way of interacting with newness such that it absorbs newness in a very cancerous way. It doesn't allow new becomings to breathe, but rather only to serve capital, for example, this kind of increase of Western hegemony. These potentials for interacting with new cultures, for example, is stifled by the fact that you have like the war in Iraq or Afghanistan or the coups in Nicaragua and Chile and all this different stuff that is poisoning the well, and you could say, well, we can change this. No. An important fact to note is that this is built into the capitalist framework of how it interacts with the world as a collective assemblage of enunciation. And they mentioned that another one of these kind of collective assemblages is Muslim fundamentalism, which we've seen rise more and more and more. Now, of course, not all on its own. It's had U.S. help, for sure, in order to create a veritable opposition to the war on terror in order to justify increasing expansion of the neo-imperial United States. But it's certainly an active political force. It definitely has a voice. So the important thing to note is that they do point out that there are collective assemblages of enunciation, but they're alienating. They effectively handicap everyone except the idealized kind of prophets, the oligarchs and the people who get to take all the success of these movements or the proliferation of these movements and use them for their self-interests. And they state that Europe has nothing to suggest. and France seems no longer to have any other ambition than to assume the leadership of an Americanized and overarmed Europe that would impose the necessary economic redeployment from above. This is something we see today, is that all other kind of European countries, and this is not just an American being narcissistic, but it's just a fact of the matter that the Western hegemony is being led by the US, and many other European countries are trailing behind them as, oh, this is how we should be acting. And they point out that there are a number of ways in which the world is bifurcated on the east-west axis or the north-south axis, and they state that these are problematic. These are going to, of course, engender forms of hegemony and ways of subjectification that are going to interfere with the average person being able to just have a political voice. And they say, kind of, after this whole pessimistic rant, which it's kind of went optimism, pessimism, and back to a little bit of optimism, they say there can only be creative solutions. These are the creative redeployments that can contribute to a resolution of the current crisis and that can take over where a generalized May 68 amplified bifurcation or fluctuation left off. So the important thing to note is they're not telling us to abandon these movements, but they're not telling us to be dogmatic to them either. They're saying that, okay, kind of American-style capitalism, it is a force. It is something that needs to be reckoned with on the world stage, but not something which we should assume has a privileged position. It is a moment of history. It is going to go out of history via these ahistorical breaks, these amplified bifurcations or fluctuations. And May 68 is crucial because it is effectively going to shape these new subjectivities that can come about. And if we let the climate created and opened up by May 68 truncate in this American-style capitalism or Muslim fundamentalism or Afro-American religion like in Brazil, really not sure what they mean by that, so we're just going to ignore that. But these are the possibilities which have effectually came after May 68, but which have not been able to swallow up May 68. And thus, they're merely opening up a political project which asks us to become, asks us to experiment, as they say in A Thousand Plateaus, merely asks us to look at May 68 and not try to reduce it, but to look at all its molecular components and see, okay, where are our lines of flight? Where are our moments in which we can effectuate a new form of political consciousness? So I hope this has been helpful in getting at some of the political implications of Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy and also relating it to some of their thought in A Thousand Plateaus. If you have any questions or constructive or non-constructive criticism, please put it in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.